diving right in.
Oh, yeah. So which kind of questions do you want to ask? You can go to start from the top? Or?
Okay, we're live.
We're live. Real. This is live. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Webinar. Awesome.
Yay. I'm here. This is Sydney. This is Alex.
This is Alex, yeah.
Alex Bisker, project manager extraordinaire. We are here today to answer some student questions about project management. A bunch of you wrote in and you had some really interesting questions about things that you're struggling with at the moment with your businesses. So I'm excited to hear some insight.
Yeah.
As to how to tackle that. All right. So this person had a question about managing their company internally versus external factors.
Okay.
They want to accomplish tasks faster, run multiple tasks in parallel, and then and they had a question which I thought was really interesting about holding co-founders accountable and keeping them motivated.
Wow.
That's tough.
That's a big honking question. There's a lot of elements there. So just to break it down a little bit, accomplishing tasks faster and then running multiple tasks at the same time is a huge issue that everyone faces, whether you're just starting off or whether it's a well-established company. The biggest thing that I found is successful is looking at those dependencies, especially when you're looking at tasks that you're doing in parallel. If you want to get something done faster, you need to map it out. You need to map out the dependencies that need to happen. And even though something might be due in an hour, something that might be due in 3 hours needs a 3-hour lead time. So it's lining those priorities up by not just what's in front of your face.
Right.
It's lining them up the priority that things need to happen and making sure that you can kind of do that cascade in a way that's manageable. And it's a really hard habit to break, especially with things like email and Slack. You have all these notifications,
right, things coming at you, just
totally. And you've got to manage that and set aside time. For me, it's time each day to say, here are what my priorities are for today, for the week, for the month, for the quarter, and just looking at all of those in kind of a full, bird's eye view, as it were, and kind of aligning on that priority list, make sure that I'm looking at things from a perspective of what do I actually need to accomplish and not, okay, great, I replied to all my notifications, but I haven't gotten any work done today. Setting aside time to do that, though, is crucial. You need to actually do 10 minutes a day. Maybe it's an hour a day, depends on what your needs are, but actually carve that time out and don't overschedule it for any reason. You have to do it. Yeah, it's a big priority. So I think that that's one of the easier said than done things. But if it's a priority for everyone on your team, from the intern to the CEO, it becomes a practice that people can just do. So, and the other one,
great.
Keeping the co-founders.
Yeah, keeping your co-founder motivated and accountable.
Ooh,
that's
tough.
Loaded.
Yeah, it's a really loaded question, and it's really hard, and it's that's a very broad question from the role of the project or the product manager of how is that part of it, and a lot of it is setting those expectations at the beginning. In your role as a product manager or as a project manager, you are kind of confined to what you can do for the health of the project that you're working on. That might not be for the larger scale of the business. If you're thinking of this in terms of you are a co-founder and it's your fellow co-founder that you're trying to keep accountable, I would suggest actually stepping back. And if that's an issue, if that's an issue you're running into, there are some larger issues at play that you need to address, unfortunately. So that's a bigger question. And it's something that comes up with project management all the time with stakeholders. Right. People are not as involved. There are other things at play. So you need to have those conversations and have the hard ones.
This actually, this sort of gets at a few other questions. You've raised some points that other people have brought up. I guess we can skip right over to a sponsor, having a good sponsor strategy. This student asked, what's the best strategy for working with sponsors and what are great ways to manage up?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's very easy with sponsors to put their priorities on they'll take care of it from their side and they'll tell me what they need and then I'll take care of it. Working in conjunction with them and setting those regular times to check in and reprioritize is super helpful. The more you can bring them into your team as well, the more ownership they'll feel of it, to go back to their stakeholders. So what I find is really useful if you're doing a website or a product of some sort, to bring them into not just the demos, but also the retros and also the sprint planning. The more that they can get their, even if it's not their fingers in the actual planning, but see what that's like, they'll have more involvement. And also making sure that you're giving them the tools that they need to communicate actively to the stakeholders that they're managing from their side. The best way to manage up is to make sure you're giving them the tools that they need so that they can talk to their boss or their stakeholders. Sometimes that means writing technical issues out in plain English. Other times it means bullet points. Other times it means drawing things. Like I've done everything for different kinds of sponsors or product owners. And it's very important to meet them where they're at. Like you can't just keep spouting technical knowledge at them and expect them to understand. If they're very technical, that's great, but the people they're reporting to might not be. So working with them in that way is helpful. And it's also really good just to schedule, normal check-ins. I think this is a theme that I'm running into of like the normal check-ins, that checking in with people, talk with them, the over-communication, and documenting it. Honestly, their written stuff is super helpful. So even if you have a daily phone call or a daily, stand-up on Google Hangouts, document it. Like have a running list of here's what we talked about, here's what we're going to do, action items. Make their job as easy as possible. I a lot of times as the project manager, I'm like, my job is to make everyone else's job easier. Whether that's like, if you need a reminder ping, you need this, that's what you can do for them as well as your team.
Right. Find the best way they want to communicate. Let's see. Trying to think of somebody asked a question and you just sort of mentioned doing a check-in on a Google Hangout. And I thought this was a really great question when I read this. I was like, oh my God, so many people are handling this all the time. So somebody had a question about managing a remote team.
Yeah.
And I think that's really common nowadays, having many members of your team be remote. And in this case, this person has their entire team working remotely. And they said, how do I keep everyone on task? How do I make sure that everyone is contributing equally and are on the same page when it comes to priorities? Also, they're using tools like Slack, Trello, Hangouts, email, phone, and text. But what's a good way to keep the human groundedness and keep the conversation flowing and making sure everybody's happy?
No, that's a great question. I actually myself work on a fully distributed team. So for my project, for example, currently my development team is in San Francisco and I'm in New York. So we're on not just in different places, but in a biggest time zone difference you can have in the States. And it's great. It's actually fabulous. The tools that this person mentioned are super helpful. I think one thing to note with those tools is how you use them. That's a lot of different tool sets. And one of the things to focus a remote team is how you're going to use Slack, how you're going to use email, and how you're going to use all these tools. It's not just, we have these, communicate, go. Email becomes a very, very rare thing for us to use. Slack is where everything happens. And specific uses of things like @here or @channel, tagging someone's name for specific things becomes very important. Of @here is for a time sensitive, hey, I have a question that I need to talk to somebody that's not all hands on deck, fire, but it's someone who's on Slack at that moment. @channel is a site's down, something's critical happening. And if there's tagging someone's name, that makes sure that they get a notification in their inbox. Understanding how those things work seems really basic, but it's incredibly important when you're actually working with a remote team of this is not important that they see it right now. This is important that they see it eventually, not right now. This is important that everybody who's around gets this right now. And understanding how that communication works is super important. And that you've set up those kind of expectations from the beginning. Things like we're not going to use email, or we're going to do a stand-up every day and it's going to be on Google Hangouts because it's important to see us face-to-face. Using those tools in different ways, make sure that your team is going to be better at that. You also have to work with how your team best prioritizes work. You have to trust your team. There's a lot of trust with a remote team, but ultimately a team that has their priorities set up and is very, if you've got your Trello board or your Waffle or whatever it is, set up in a way that they always know what they have to work on, there should be no question of what's happening. If you're doing a daily stand-up in a way that you're getting information and feedback on what they have worked on, what they're currently working on, and anything that's blocking them. That communication is what's going to make sure your team is successful. In terms of managing their time, it was a huge adjustment for me to be like, oh, my team is going to be working 3 hours later than I am usually.
Right.
I'm going to be on 3 hours earlier. And accepting that and embracing that is awesome. Like once you fully acknowledge, like, it's not, oh my God, I can't get a hold of them at 9 in the morning. It's, oh, this is a great way for like, we can do a stand up at the end of my day.
Sure.
And they still have 3 hours to work.
Right.
And it's a really great tool. I can get prioritization stuff done in the morning.
Yep.
So that by the time they're in, they're really clear on priorities or if there's any changes overnight.
Right.
So it's really helpful that way. You know, I would say the constant theme is just the over communication.
I think it can be kind of nice just for preparation when you have a meeting with someone, or I guess if I have a meeting with someone on the West Coast, I'm like, oh, okay. Like, it's 9 a.m. for them, but
I've had a little more time.
Yep.
And it's also really important when you're working with a semi-distributed team to make sure that you've included the remote people all of the time. It become very easy to be like, oh, we'll just be on the call together, Sydney and I, and then our other teammate will dial in separately. It's much better if we all dialed in separately, so we're all equal. This way it's not like we're trying to share a mic or we're trying to do this. The more you can make it that remote first mindset, the better, because then you're including your whole team and you're putting everybody on the same page.
I love that.
It's a really awesome mindset.
We should get a sign
for
our office that says
totally.
That. I'd love to hear input from our remote employees.
Totally. Yeah, it's a constant thing that's changing in the workforce right now, and it's super awesome. Like when teams are doing it well, it's really exciting. And like there's always going to be like friction points, but the more you can voice those, that's another thing. Make sure your team has a way to voice concerns in a constructive way of like, hey, like it sucks that the stand-up is never a time when I can do it, or like whatever.
Right.
Make sure your team can get that feedback and you can do something with it, because you can't improve the remote workforce until you hear what's wrong with them. If you're like, oh, they have a really bad connection where they're at.
Right.
Troubleshoot that issue. Like those things add up and like become issues.
Right. And they might think that you don't care as much about them.
Right.
If you're not acknowledging their technical issues or taking the time to be like, what works for you?
Yeah.
Like what time works for you? How do you like to communicate best? And
totally.
That is so cool. I hope that was helpful. I hope the person's watching who asked that question. This person asked, how do I become more organized? I want to achieve outcomes faster professionally and personally. It's a little vague, but I think that's important, especially for the person who asked this question is just starting their business for the first time. And they're probably realizing, oh my God, I have to get all this project management software. I'm going to have to interact with people. They've probably been working alone for a while.
Right. No, it's a huge question. And there's whole industries built around answering this question. Many businesses built around answering this question. And I think for me, the biggest thing is always to step back and like realize you don't need all the tools. You don't need most of the tools. You need the tools that work for you. And if that's, for me, one of the tools that I have to have is a notebook. I have to write some things down. I do everything, on the computer, all this, but I need to write a couple of things down because it helps me ground myself. Right. It helps me remember this is my list.
And that's how we grew up. We grew up writing. Things.
Yeah, exactly. And like figuring out what those tools are for you and like kind of stepping back of, I feel the most organized, the most productive when I do X. And also the inverse of like, I feel the most scattered when Y. Having those kind of two lists and then seeing how you can use that information to make this separate column of like, these are my tools to succeed. For me, I feel really scattered when I answer all of my emails and I have meetings, but I don't take time to write summaries afterwards.
Right.
I feel really scattered when I write things on Post-it notes and not in my notebook. But I really like the colors of Post-it notes, and I really like that kind of like color coordinating thing. So I do digital stickies. And that way I can have everything that I want from the Post-it notes of the coordination, and I can move them around my screen, and I feel like very organized, but I don't lose them, and I don't feel scattered. And then also whatever your tasks are, you need to prioritize what those are. And a lot of times it's letting go of some things, of whether that means delegating to, you know, other members of your team, realizing you should get a project manager. Those kind of things are really important because you can't organize all aspects of everything. You have to organize what works for you.
Right.
There's tons of tools out there. Do a Google search. They're all great. At the core of it, like, you need some way to keep track of things. You need some way to communicate things to your team. Like, that's it. And if that's pencil and paper, because it's just you, that's fine. As long as you find a system that works for you. You can do the, you know, tasks in the morning, you can do all these different techniques, but like at the core of it, like, don't read the 50 million articles on this. Find what works for you and just practice it and experiment, iterate, to, you know, to go agile on it. Like, try this thing for a day, try this thing for a day. If it kind of works, try it for a week, and then play with it. Like, it's not a set in stone thing. Things change. Like, I never used digital stickies for the longest time. Now I'm obsessed with them.
Yeah. And also, like, your team grows, and or you switch jobs, or you're like a solo founder, and all of a sudden you have 4 members, and then one app or software might work for that. We used to do HipChat and only Trello.
Yeah.
And then now that our company's bigger, we find that Asana and Slack are
are better tools for you.
Yeah, better tools. And we might not have needed Asana back in the beginning when it was just 4 of us.
Yeah. One thing that I do find is, like, as far as like a personal tip, is when I wake up in the morning, I spend an hour just on my personal email and my personal, like, to-do list.
Cool.
Because I work from home a lot. I'm like, oh, some days that means I will do the dishes. Some days that means I will respond to my personal emails, send this correspondence, whatever, so that I can just not worry about it for the rest of the day. Because it really, for me, those things come back up where I'm like, I'm bored or anxious or something that I'm meeting, and I open up my email and there's this whole thing. But if I'm like,
it clears your head.
Clear your head. Like, that's really helpful for me to kind of get myself organized so that I can put that aside. So.
That leads into another question. You sort of just answered this a little bit, but someone asked a question about daily tasks. How do you personally, as a project manager, manage your daily tasks and how does it differ from work tasks?
Yeah, so for a while I was experimenting when I was doing freelance work with running my my freelance projects and my personal life off of Basecamp, which was super interesting because it was like running my life like a project.
Right.
And it ended up being a little intense, a little too much of like assigning myself due dates and tasks. Was a little, like, became a little like meta, but it was really helpful to keep track of my freelance projects. Personally, what I like to do is, like I said, I separate my day into personal and work. Really critical for working at home, for remote workers.
Right.
I try and do those tasks. I keep running lists, and I have one sticky on my work computer that is, it's ridiculous. It's called Master Scribble Pad of Anything in My Head, and this Master Scribble Pad of Anything in My Head has anything that I'm like, oh, I need to remember to do that, or like, oh, I need to send my mom a birthday present, or oh, I need to, anything that pops in my head that distracts me during the day, I write it down. So that it's not...
somewhere to go.
Yeah, there's somewhere to go. It always goes in that sticky. And at the end of the day, the last thing I do is always grab that and send it over to my personal email. So then it's clean. It's clean on my work computer. It's in my personal...
Good tactic.
It's great because then I never lose anything. I'm always afraid of like, oh, I have all these things. Or I'm like, I look over there, like, oh, there's like a pair of pants I should return or something like random.
Right.
And that personal stuff like bubbles up. This is a way for me to capture it. I also have the same thing on my personal computer. So if there's something of like, oh, there's a professional idea I want to do, or I have this, or a question I want to ask.
Right.
It's very helpful for me to have 2 different computers because then I don't, end up doing work. But having that same sticky on both computers makes sure that there's always something for me to do and I can capture it digitally. And I keep my personal inbox to 25 or less.
Really?
Yeah.
You're an inbox hero.
Yeah, I'm an inbox
25er.
Inbox 0 is both wonderful and anxiety inducing because I send off these emails and on inbox 0 and then everyone starts replying.
Right.
Like, I should reply about real quick.
Yeah, it seems really stressful.
Yeah, it's really stressful to try and keep, but inbox, keeping my inbox to a reasonable amount and anything that's over a month old, I either archive or respond to. Like that's kind of a good balance for me of like, if it's over a month old, there's no reason for it.
Right.
And I highly encourage anybody whose inbox is bigger than that to like do a purge and just like start fresh. Because if someone needs you, they'll reply back. Like,
right.
It's crucial for me to get ahead of my email because there's just so many other projects that I'm doing that are fun. And like, you know, I want to talk to Sydney, but I'm like, I don't want to forget that. I'm also really big about color coding, like labels, like really intensely. Like and setting up all the rules. Rules are critical for like professional stuff, but also for personal. So anything that comes in from Sydney, for example, is bright orange. And that's her color. So when I see Sydney, I think orange. But like, you know, if it comes in from my, you know, my sister, it's one color. If it's this, so I can look at my inbox in a moment and be like, oh, there's like this many work things I need to do. There's this many personal things. It's really helpful.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that, actually. Great. I'm trying to think of what's the best transition that we can do. I liked this one about creative problem solving. And in your course, well, let's see, I wrote in your course, but in one of your bonus videos, you mentioned the importance of being flexible as a project manager, and that's one of the, like a really high level or just a really important quality to have.
Yeah.
And what are some techniques you use to creatively problem solve on a daily basis, or how do you tackle things creatively?
No, that's a great question. One of my favorites is just to ask why, like all the time. And just keep asking the question.
Yeah, until you get to the meat of it.
Until you get to the meat of it. Like pleading ignorance is very helpful because there's a lot of things that I'm just ignorant of that I just don't know as a technical person. But forcing people to think about the problem in the simplest terms. I think I talked a little bit about like the rubber duck problem solving technique. I'm a huge fan of the like articulate the problem, and you'll be like 10 times closer to the solution. That asking that why is a really good way of doing that. That's super helpful because you can get to kind of the core of like what the actual concern is, what are the real constraints. I like to do a lot of like brainstorming with the team or with other people as well, kind of bringing all of that together of you know, what is the issue, not like what is the solution, but like what is the problem that we're trying to solve.
Right.
Because it can be really easy for people to say like, well, this is the thing we need to do. We need to do this.
Right.
And like there's solution storming, and that's not what you need. You need to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important element. And when the creative aspect comes into it is being open to and making sure that your team and that your sponsor and your product owner are open to creative solutions. Like it's not just this is the only way that we can solve this problem. It's let's talk about it. Let's figure it out.
Because the solution might not have been something that you had ever imagined.
Yeah. And really the flexibility comes down to like, things are going to change. They're always going to change. Priorities come and you think you have everything set. Your Trello is all beautiful and you know exactly what you're working on. And then this super big priority comes in and everything has to change. And the flexibility and the creative nature of it comes in of like water off a duck's back. Just gotta let it go. Like nothing is precious, and just realign, just be flexible, just change and let maybe, oh, this thing that came in, this big priority can actually help solve this other issue that you didn't have. You know, I've run into recently a couple issues of like, everything got reprioritized, but because we had to solve this thing, it actually solved 3 other issues that had been in the backlog. So like that kind of stuff, you need to be open to looking at the larger issue and not just, oh, this is this thing in front of me and it's a problem.
So not getting stuck in those roadblocks.
Yeah.
Let's see. What is the best skill a project manager can have, or if you, let's say, don't have that skill in place, what's something you can hone in on?
Communication, like bar none. You need a lot of skills. You need to like understand how a budget works and like tracking burn, and you need to understand like, how to run a sprint and like all these kind of like actual like hard skills. But you can teach all that. Like that's all like you can like, okay, here's how budget works, and you can like figure that out. Communication is something you have to practice, and like you learn by doing and by improving on it like actively and consciously. Like it needs to be done with intention. And that's something that it's always the weakest point of a new product manager. And it's always a point that can be improved no matter how experienced you are.
Right.
It's something you don't grow out of. Because when your budget is going off the rails, or when you need more money, or when one of your developers is out sick or something like that, you're going to need to use the communication skills. All the hard skills, communication is involved with them. Working with your team, working with your sponsor, it's always going to be a part of your life. So communication is something you should always work on, and in every way, shape, or form of interpersonal communication, of public speaking, any kind of course or program or practice you can use to like get better at that is going to help you.
Right.
I encourage a lot of people to do like improv comedy, because it's a great way to kind of get in touch with communication and anticipating others' needs and empathizing. Public speaking too, even though a lot of your communication is going to be on like Slack.
Yeah,
it still translates.
Right.
So.
And everybody communicates so differently, and I think that's the trickiest part for me as a producer.
Totally.
Was all the hard things about learning that every single person that you're dealing with on a daily basis, regardless of if they're in a sponsor position or whatever it is, or if they're you're coordinating some tiny minute thing with somebody, a contractor, everybody has a completely different style that they're comfortable communicating with, and so you have to get comfortable communicating with people in their style.
Totally.
Because like no one's gonna come over and to your onto your ship or whatever. That's, I don't know, a ship.
No, you have to meet them where they're at. And you have to meet them where they're at and then take them a little bit further if needed. A lot of times, the biggest struggle that I have as project manager is when someone doesn't want to communicate back. And a lot of that is just going over until something sticks. And so you try like, is it Slack? Is it email? Is it call? Is it what is it that sticks with this person? And it's so interesting to find different people have different things. Like one person might be like, oh, they're totally a phone call person. Like they have to have a phone call. And other people are like, I need a reminder about everything.
Right. And I love when people say that.
Yeah. It's the
Somebody
best.
said that to me yesterday. They were like, I was like, are you free to do this thing in 2 weeks? And they're like, yep, you'll just remind me 8 times before it happens. And I'm like, okay.
And now I know. It's great. And I try to ask
most
those
people
questions.
Would hate that.
Yeah. But I try and ask those questions when I can so that I'm not pestering if I can avoid it. Though sometimes you have to do that anyways. But of like, if you can possibly make sure that you're doing something for them that is helpful, of like, great, like we agreed to this. And at the end of the conversation, I'm always like, do you want me to ping you about this? Or are you good? Like, do you want a reminder? Do you want a calendar invite? And like, I'm surprised when people are like, oh, actually, yeah. Like, okay, thanks. And it's so helpful for both of us because then it's like this reminder happens and we make sure that we don't forget this conversation we had on Slack 3 weeks ago. So yeah, no, totally on the same page.
The tricky part is when somebody's like, yeah, I don't really use Google Calendar. I'm like, oh yeah, where did you like, then you have to like remember that they won't remember. And you're like, and then you're like, how do you do things?
Yeah, like how do you actually keep track of things? Yeah, no, I'm a huge Google Calendar fan.
Yeah. This actually is in alignment with some of the sponsor stuff. I was like, is that the right question? How do you collect, someone asked, how do you collect project status updates from people on your team and remind them about being on time without being perceived as a pain in the ass?
That is the question. So I tend to err on the side of like, if someone's going to be a pain in the ass, you might as well be the pain in the ass because it's going to ultimately end up being a pain in your ass if you don't have the updates. So I'm a huge fan of the over communication, and it's not, you have to develop that skin of like, don't mean to be a pest, checking in, whatever. Like, it doesn't matter if someone is irritated. If it's something that you need and it's something they're responsible for, there's no shame and there's no harm in asking. Again, it's figuring out how things happen. I always set ticks and reminders if for example, Sydney's on my team and I'm like, okay, I need this thing from Sydney. I send it to her and I put a tick in my, in my boomerang or whatever it happens to be that I'm using of like, for a day. If I haven't heard from her, then it bubbles up back to the top of my list. If it's, 2 days, it bubbles up again. So I'm always on the next. I always know I'm going to reach out when if I haven't heard by X. part of that is also setting expectations at the beginning. I think I talked about a little bit in the course of when you're sending emails, make sure you include this is when I need it by, and this is exactly what I need.
Right.
Like that information goes a long way, because there's so many times when someone's like, yeah, I'll get that. I'm doing it. But you haven't communicated, no, I needed that by noon.
Right.
Why don't I have that? And that's on you. Like
setting clear times.
Setting clear timelines and clear expectations from the beginning. Make sure that you're both on the same page, so that if you do have to be a pain in the ass, you have a documented list of why you're a pain in the ass, of like, hey, so as discussed, I needed this by noon. It is now 1:30. Where the hell is it? Like, that becomes a much easier conversation because you've already laid that groundwork. So the more you can do that in advance, the better. And also setting it up so that they can communicate it to you easily, of like, I need, 3 bullets. They should include X, Y, and Z. If you can give them a template that they can drop in, whatever's going to make it easier for them to get the information that you need.
Right.
That's what you need to do.
And people, a lesson I learned from Sarah Peck recently is people won't perceive you as being rude. I know that there's like, there's that that fear of like, well, I don't want to step on anybody's toes because I don't want to seem rude in an email or something by using really direct language. And she's like, no, people want you to use direct language.
Yes.
They want you to be firm, and they'll never perceive you as rude. Like, think of how you would feel if someone was writing to you and they were like, I need X, Y, and Z by this time. You'd be like, oh, great. Because that's, you can just like read through the email and it's there. And
and it's specific.
Like
that specificity is super important, because I know exactly what I need to do. And like that's a crucial aspect, because they're getting like, a bazillion notifications and a bazillion emails. And like, if I have one that's like 5 paragraphs and I don't know what I'm supposed to do exactly because I got bored in the 3rd paragraph, and I have one that says, I need X, Y, and Z from you by this time. And I'm going to follow up by this time to check in on your progress. I know exactly what's expected of me, and then I can work on that.
Right. And
the other one will kind of languish, and then someone will hopefully get back to me, or maybe not.
Yeah. So that was a good question from somebody asking about being a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
If you think you're being a pain in the ass, then maybe you're doing something good.
Yeah, totally. And if you don't worry about it, like, that's part of your job.
Stop worrying about it.
Yeah.
This one seems a little vague. I think we've tackled most of these. I don't know if did we jump into risk? Let's talk about anticipating risks. I know that this is something that it's like the big scary thing.
Yeah.
How do you tackle anticipating risks and dealing with the scary unknowns and
it's
changes?
really difficult. I think there's a couple moments in the course where we talk about like some risk management like techniques and how to go about doing that. But on kind of a broad, top line level, I think that doing those, the kind of like risk storming exercises of like talking about what these risks could be and what those fears are is super helpful. You take the power away from risks when you talk about them.
Yep.
And you kind of mitigate and plan for them. Things like, well, this thing can't happen. Okay, well, what happens if it does? What happens if we do go over budget? What happens if we do lose half of our developers because another emergency project comes up? What happens if X? And kind of planning, you don't need to plan for those scenarios
but just like addressing them.
Address them and like acknowledge them. And then from that, you can kind of make a list of these are the most realistic issues that are most likely to arise. I might have mentioned it before, but like NASA is famous for like imagining all those scenarios of like, if this screw goes loose, you do X, Y, and Z, and they have these massive books that are like, this thick,
about the screw,
like every scenario, because they're in a situation as an astronaut in space, where they don't have time to formulate a plan. They have to go to exactly a pre-formulated plan of this is what happens. You're not an astronaut, or if you are, then kudos to you, but you probably shouldn't be watching this course. I don't have a lot to tell you because you're in space. So you have the luxury of being able to be nimble. And the more you can force is a bad word. The more you can encourage your team and work yourself in an agile way that is nimble and responds well to risks and to changing scenarios, the better off you're going to be to handle risk. That's going to really mitigate your risk. You're not saying, here are the specs that we have, and here's how we're going to function, and it has to be like this. That's when you get yourself worked into like huge risks pile up. the more agile that you can be and the more agile you can practice, the healthier you're going to be with those risks, because you can change and adjust as things come up. If you're like, oh, we're burning the budget at a faster rate, we can adjust what our feature set is going to be. We can, turn out a different MVP than what we thought, that kind of thing. So
that just returns to our theme of flexibility.
Yeah,
and being creative and allowing for the unknowns.
Totally.
Well, that's so great. I think that those are all of our questions.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us. We've had I've been watching our little viewer count. We've had a couple of viewers here today.
Excellent.
And I'm excited to put this in the course, and hopefully it'll be helpful for people.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye, everybody.